In 1983, a drunk man threw a boot at Roy Rogers during a live show. He wasn't angry. He was confused. He thought Roy was the singing cowboy from old movies and couldn't understand why he was playing blues. That wasn't even the worst case of mistaken identity in Roy's life. By the time he turned 60, he'd worked with Miles Davis, won Grammys, and watched his best friend die from cancer caused by smoky club air. But the one thing he could never escape was a name his brother gave him as a joke. And that joke followed him everywhere, even onto stages where people didn't believe he was real. This is the story of a man who was never supposed to make it. Roy Franklin Rogers was born on July 28, 1950, in Redding, California, to William and Luverne Rogers, a working-class couple doing their best to get by. His older brother Billy, who was obsessed with old cowboy films, pushed for the name Roy Rogers, thinking it would be a funny tribute to the famous singing cowboy. Their mother agreed partly because a distant uncle had the same first name, but the full name stuck, and that decision followed Roy everywhere. While other kids were called by their first names, he was always Roy Rogers, and that alone made him a magnet for teasing. He wore cowboy boots to school once, just once, and never heard the end of it. They laughed, they pointed, they said, "Here comes Roy Rogers in his cowboy boots." Years later, he could laugh about it and even say it gave him his sense of humor. But back then, it was rough. At home, though, things were different. His mother, Luverne, was magic at the piano. She didn't just play it, she lived it. She could be wiping down a counter 1 second and then suddenly walk over and start playing something beautiful, right in the middle of her chores. She had that kind of ear where music didn't come from the sheet, it came from the feeling. Roy would sit there, watching, listening, soaking it all in. Before he even picked up a guitar, he was picking out little melodies on a toy keyboard, imitating what he heard his mother do. It wasn't formal training, it was something deeper, more natural, something that rooted itself inside him and never left. When Roy was 10, the family packed up and moved from quiet, rural Redding to Vallejo in the San Francisco Bay Area. It was a huge shift. His dad, a former Liberty ship captain from World War II, had landed a major job overseeing the mothball fleet in Suisun Bay, a graveyard of hundreds of military ships just sitting in the water. It was a big deal, and it meant the family had to leave the small-town life behind. For Roy, this new environment felt like a jolt. Vallejo was louder, faster, more diverse, and full of movement. He felt like he didn't belong at first. But then something started happening. The Bay Area was bubbling with music, real music, and Roy found himself drawn to it like a magnet. His father ran a tight ship at home, just like he did at work. William Rogers wasn't the kind of guy to cut corners. He believed in showing up early, working hard, and doing things right the first time. Roy delivered newspapers before school just to have his own spending money, and it was with those earnings that he made a decision that would change his life. In 1962, at the age of 12, he bought a Stella acoustic guitar for $25, the exact amount he'd saved from that route. It wasn't a gift, he earned it. And once he had it, he couldn't put it down. He played for hours every day, building up calluses, figuring out chords, and chasing the sound in his head. Meanwhile, Billy, the same brother who named him, had started sneaking records into the house. These weren't the kind of records their parents liked. These were raw, loud, and electric. Roy heard Elvis for the first time through Billy's contraband collection. Then Little Richard. Then something different altogether. One day, Billy brought home a Robert Johnson record, the king of the Delta blues singers. That album didn't just inspire Roy, it shook him. The way Johnson used a slide on the strings, the open tunings, the eerie, almost voice-like guitar, Roy became obsessed. He stayed up all night trying to figure out those sounds by ear. He wasn't reading music. He wasn't taking lessons. He was listening and chasing it down note by note. By the time he was 13, Roy had joined a band called the Newports. They played Chuck Berry. They wore shiny gold lame jackets, and they performed at local dances where a live band was still a requirement if you wanted people to show up. Roy was the youngest in the group, but he kept up. He learned quickly by playing with older, more experienced musicians. The energy on stage, the way the crowd responded, it hooked him completely. In high school, while his classmates got into the psychedelic wave sweeping through San Francisco, Roy went the other direction. He wasn't interested in swirling lights and fuzz pedals. He wanted blues, the real stuff. He took buses alone into the city just to watch guys like Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, and John Lee Hooker. He wasn't there to party. He was there to study. He watched every hand movement, every facial expression, every note. These weren't just concerts to him. They were lessons. In 1968, 2 weeks before he graduated from Vallejo High, Roy and his bandmates helped B.B. King carry his gear up the stairs at a local VFW hall in town. The crowd was mostly older black fans, dressed to the nines, nodding along with every bend and slide from B.B.'s guitar. Then, not long after, Roy saw King again, this time at Fillmore West in San Francisco. That night, B.B. King got his first standing ovation from a mostly white, young, hippie crowd. He cried on stage, and Roy stood there watching the whole thing, realizing something was changing. Blues was crossing over. It wasn't just underground anymore, but even then, Roy stayed grounded in the roots. He didn't chase fame. He didn't follow trends. He kept buying guitars with his own money. He kept experimenting with bottleneck slides and perfecting the sound he'd first heard on that Robert Johnson record. He started playing gigs across coffee houses and clubs in the Bay Area, slowly building a reputation. By the late 1960s, just after high school, Roy had fully stepped into the blues world. He formed bands, played small venues, and never lost the fire to keep getting better. In 1976, he teamed up with harmonica player David Bergen and recorded an acoustic album called A Foot in the Door. They even contributed to the soundtrack of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest before going their separate ways. In 1976, Roy Rogers was about 26 when he teamed up with a harmonica player named David Bergen. This wasn't just some casual jam session, it became his first serious attempt at recording music. They called themselves Rogers and Bergen, and they recorded an album titled A Foot in the Door for Waterhouse Records. Roy had spent the early 70s playing around the Bay Area with different groups, but this time it felt different. Bergen later said he remembered how Roy used to play him old records by blues legends like Robert Johnson and Muddy Waters. That was Roy's world. He'd been obsessed with slide guitar since his teenage years when he first heard Johnson's haunting sound. The songs they recorded were their own, blending the rawness of acoustic blues with Roy's slowly evolving slide technique. This was the start of something bigger, the moment when Roy began forming his own musical identity instead of just playing in the background. A year earlier, in 1975, something unusual happened. Roy and Bergen were pulled into the orbit of Hollywood when they contributed to the soundtrack of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The film, starring Jack Nicholson and directed by Milos Forman, would go on to win 5 Oscars, including Best Picture. This was Roy's first step into cinema, though which parts of the music were his remains unclear. Still, this gig gave him a taste of something new. Film studios, deadlines, producers, and it put his name on a much bigger stage. Years later, that same entryway would lead to bigger collaborations with the likes of Miles Davis and John Lee Hooker on the Hot Spot. But it all started here, with a few slide notes buried in a movie score. By 1977, Roy and Bergen were performing all over California. They weren't headlining major venues, but they were working steadily across coffee houses and clubs, especially around the Bay Area. These were small places where the audience could sit close and actually watch your fingers move. Roy thrived in these rooms. He wasn't flashy, but his playing had grit and depth, and the slide guitar made people stop and listen. This is where he began developing the kind of live confidence that can't be taught. Night after night, show after show, he sharpened his skills and built a name among local blues fans. You might not find posters or attendance records from every night, but those small gigs laid down the path that would carry him far beyond California. Eventually, the duo ran its course. No public fallout, no big headlines. They simply went their separate ways sometime before 1979. That was when Roy began thinking bigger. The acoustic setup had its charm, but he wanted to plug in, go electric, build a real band. Some sources say he formed his new group in '79, others in 1980. Either way, it was around then that he brought the Delta Rhythm Kings to life. It was a three-piece band, and Roy finally had full control. This time, he wasn't part of someone else's act. He was the act. Everything started moving fast. On January 15, 1980, in Novato, California, Roy launched the Delta Rhythm Kings officially with a packed 90-minute set at the Last Day Saloon. The lineup included bassist Steve Ehrman and drummer Tom Bray. They kept things tight and simple, letting Roy's slide guitar carry the sound. And it wasn't just how he played, it was how he played. Roy wore his slide on the pinky of his left hand, which let him keep the rhythm going while laying down melody and bass lines at the same time. It was like watching three musicians in one body. Behind the scenes, Roy's wife, Gaynell Toller Rogers, stepped in to manage bookings and publicity. She understood the value of grassroots growth. This combination of raw music and strategic planning turned Roy's small operation into something that could last. By 1982, the band hit Europe with the San Francisco Blues Festival Review. They recorded a live album in Paris, and during one track, Slidewinder, Roy's solo brought the house down so hard that people stood and clapped for 5 straight minutes. That trip changed everything. Suddenly, Roy was playing in Italy, Switzerland, Norway, even Brazil and Australia. And back in the States, his name started buzzing. Just after that tour, he joined John Lee Hooker's Coast to Coast Blues Band, thanks to a recommendation from Steve Ehrman. He'd work with Hooker for the next 4 years, and those sessions led to Grammy nominations, respect from jazz greats like Miles Davis, and a much wider audience. Then came the Texas incident. It was 1983, and the Delta Rhythm Kings were deep into a show when a drunken guy in the crowd started yelling and finally threw a boot onto the stage. The man wasn't mad. He was confused. He thought Roy Rogers was the famous cowboy from old movies and couldn't believe this Roy was on stage playing blues. It almost turned into a fight, but Roy cooled things off with a joke and rolled with it. The whole situation became part of band lore. It even inspired him to name his label Chops, Not Chaps, a reminder that he was a slide guitarist, not a rhinestone cowboy. By 1984, Roy made it official. He launched Chops, Not Chaps Records and released his first solo album, Chops, Not Chaps, in 1985. It had 12 tracks, and one by one, they showed exactly what made Roy special. He wasn't copying the blues, he was adding to it, giving it edge and humor and a bit of swing. Songs like 3220 Blues and Devil Got My Woman got radio play across the country. That album even hit number 15 on the blues charts, which was no small feat for someone running their own label. He didn't need a big record company. By owning everything himself, Roy kept his music the way he wanted and built a career that was both personal and sustainable. That same year, 1984, Roy also married Gaynell Toller. She'd seen him play at the Great American Music Hall back in 1980 and was shocked to learn he wasn't black. She had heard his music on the radio and assumed he was from the South, maybe Mississippi or Georgia. But once they met, it clicked. Gaynell wasn't just a romantic partner. She became the engine behind his career. She had run a booking agency in Atlanta and knew the ins and outs of music marketing. In 1985 alone, she booked over 100 shows for Roy, including gigs opening for Stevie Ray Vaughan. She took care of the business so Roy could focus on his music. Together, they created a working life that was steady, independent, and completely their own. In 1985, Roy Rogers was fresh off a European tour with the San Francisco Blues Festival when he joined John Lee Hooker's Coast to Coast Band. He wasn't just another guitarist in the lineup. He was about to become Hooker's closest creative partner. For 4 years, Roy played guitar and sang alongside Hooker, learning the older man's unusual sense of rhythm, which didn't follow typical blues patterns. Most musicians struggled to keep up, but Roy didn't just keep up, he matched it, deepened it. They clicked. One song, I'm in the Mood, which Roy co-wrote with Hooker and Bonnie Raitt, was done in just one take. That single recording would later win a Grammy and become a turning point. Hooker, who was in his 70s, told people Roy's slide guitar was some of the best he'd ever heard. That praise wasn't empty. It marked the start of a comeback few expected. Hooker had been fading from the spotlight. Now he was back in it, and Roy Rogers was the man helping him shine. That comeback came to life in September 1989 with the release of The Healer. Hooker was 73 and, after decades in the business, finally had a Grammy-winning album. For the first time in his career, he landed on the Billboard charts at number 62. The album didn't just revive his career, it changed his life. Roy produced the sessions at Russian Hill Recording Studios in San Francisco. He paired Hooker with top-tier guests like Carlos Santana, Bonnie Raitt, and Robert Cray. One song, Baby Lee, brought Cray's new school energy to Hooker's old soul. Another, the title track, The Healer, was co-written by Rogers and featured Santana's guitar dancing around Hooker's voice. Critics called it genius. The album went gold in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the Netherlands. After years of financial struggle, Hooker started receiving royalty checks that actually meant something. For the first time, he could relax and enjoy the fruits of his music. But making The Healer wasn't all smooth. Hooker and Rogers fought. Bad. During one session in 1988, they argued for 3 straight hours over how fast Baby Lee should be. Rogers got so fed up, he almost quit. Hooker had a way of playing that ignored the usual 12-bar blues structure, and that drove even experienced musicians crazy. You needed serious ears to stay with him. But the solution came from the music itself. One night, after a long day of arguing, they started jamming around midnight. That take became the version that made it onto the album. That kind of messy, magical energy was what made their work so special. They didn't always agree, but they made it work. And people noticed. After The Healer, they didn't stop. Roy produced 3 more albums with Hooker. In 1991, Mr. Lucky came out, with guests like Keith Richards, Albert Collins, Van Morrison, and Booker T. Jones. It hit number 101 on the Billboard 200 and grabbed a Grammy nomination. In 1992, they dropped Boom Boom, which brought back Hooker's 1962 classic and added Jimmy Vaughan into the mix. By 1995, they were added again with Chill Out, which got to number 3 on the US Blues chart and won the W.C. Handy Award. Robert Cray kept returning, building a cross-generational bridge through blues. In between those blues projects, something completely different happened. In 1990, Roy worked on the soundtrack for the film The Hot Spot. It wasn't just him and Hooker. Jazz icon Miles Davis was there too, along with Taj Mahal. Jack Nitzsche composed, and Roy helped produce. The result was haunting. Tracks like I'm Gone and Harry's Philosophy mixed smoky blues with Miles's whispering trumpet and Hooker's gravelly voice. Critics loved it. One even called it music people should be thankful for. Years later, a French electronic artist, Saint-Germain, sampled Harry's Philosophy in a hit called Sure Thing, introducing that sound to a whole new generation. Roy didn't just stay in blues. That same year, 1989, he co-wrote Gnawin' on It with Bonnie Raitt for her breakthrough album Nick of Time. That album sold 5 million copies and won 3 Grammys, including Album of the Year. Though the song's Grammy nomination came later in 2003, the impact started right away. Bonnie had called Roy to come jam at her house. They played around with a few ideas that afternoon, and the track was born. She later said Roy's style was one of the most fiery she'd ever heard. That project showed Roy wasn't just a blues guy. He could cross over and bring slide guitar into the mainstream. By 1998, Roy produced another Grammy-nominated project, this time for folk legend Ramblin' Jack Elliott. The album, Friends of Mine, had big names: Tom Waits, Arlo Guthrie, Emmylou Harris, John Prine, and Bob Weir. It was loose, cozy, and honest. Roy worked with a team of engineers to capture that feeling. It wasn't their first time together. Back in 1995, Roy had produced South Coast, which won Elliott his first Grammy. That kind of trust doesn't come easy in music, and Roy kept proving he knew how to get the best out of people. Outside the studio, Roy also performed with Carlos Santana and Sammy Hagar. With Santana, it was about mutual respect between two guitar lovers. With Hagar, it became more personal. Multiple sessions, lots of energy. Roy's style blended with theirs, pushing blues into rock, and even Latin territory. His guitar also made its way into soundtracks like The Hot Spot again, blending genres in ways most artists couldn't pull off. It was clear he could walk into any room with any artist and hold his ground. In 1993, he added slide guitar to Linda Ronstadt's Winter Light. A year later, he toured with Elvin Bishop. That wasn't just a one-time thing. They played festivals, venues, and even shared stages years later with Bishop's Big Fun Trio and Marcia Ball. In 2018, they were still performing together. The connection was still strong, still playful. That year, Roy got a nomination from the Blues Foundation for his guitar work. It was a nod to everything he'd done, on big stages and behind the scenes, to keep the blues alive. He didn't stop surprising people. In the mid-90s, he toured and recorded with Italian blues rock singer Zucchero, taking the blues to European crowds. But maybe the most unexpected turn came around 2005, when he started working with Ray Manzarek from The Doors. That odd pairing turned into 8 years of music that no one saw coming. They created an album called Twisted Tales, released in June 2013, just after Ray passed away in May. The songs had lyrics by poets like Jim Carroll and Michael McClure. Tracks like Eagle in a Whirlpool and Just Like Sherlock Holmes were weird, beautiful, and deep. The album debuted at number 6 on the Billboard chart and went number 1 on the American Roots Rock chart. Nobody thought blues slide and psychedelic keyboards would work together, but they did. It wasn't flashy, it was real. And it worked because Roy Rogers never stayed in one box. He kept moving, kept playing, and kept finding the soul in every song he touched. In 1987, Roy Rogers and Norton Buffalo joined forces to do something few others were doing at the time. One played slide guitar like he was born with it. The other could make a harmonica sound like an entire orchestra. They clicked instantly. 4 years later, in 1991, they finally released their debut acoustic album, R&B, under Blind Pig Records, a tiny blues label out of Michigan. The album had 12 tracks, but one stood out more than the rest. Song for Jessica, written by Roy for his daughter, earned a Grammy nomination for Best Country Instrumental Performance. That same year, they played everywhere, blending their sound with full rhythm sections and live recordings on their next album, Travelin' Tracks. Things really took off when a live video of them playing Ain't No Bread in the Bread Box aired on the Nashville network. 500,000 people watched. Blues had never crossed into country TV like that before. Between 1991 and 2002, they recorded 3 albums together, and Norton kept popping up on Roy's solo work too. The chemistry was real. Then came the shock no one was ready for. Norton, the man whose harmonica had appeared on 180 different albums, got diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. He was 58. He never smoked a cigarette in his life. On September 5, 2009, he was supposed to play a show with his longtime guitarist friend, Johnny Vernazza. He canceled. It was the first time he had ever canceled a show. The very next day, doctors told him it was stage 4. Less than 2 months later, on October 30, 2009, he was gone. People believe it was the years of playing in smoky clubs that caught up to him. His bandmates remembered wrapping their clothes in plastic bags just to keep the smoke smell out of their luggage. And still, Norton never complained. Roy Rogers lost more than a friend that year. He lost someone he called a brother. Their connection ran so deep that even after months apart, they could get on stage and play as if no time had passed. No rehearsals needed. It was just there. That kind of connection doesn't come often. Just a week after Norton's diagnosis, Roy visited him. Norton was in pain, but still smiling, still joking, still full of light. Before passing, Norton approved a memorial concert. He wanted it to help pay off the mortgage for his wife Lisa and their 2 kids. The tribute happened on January 22nd and 23, 2010, at the Fox Theater in Oakland. It was huge. Steve Miller, who had played more than 5,000 shows with Norton over 33 years, called him my partner in harmony. The Doobie Brothers, Bonnie Raitt, Huey Lewis, Roy Rogers, all showed up. Bonnie performed a song so emotional she broke down afterward. Lisa gave Steve Miller Norton's favorite hat, scarf, and harmonica. No one in the crowd forgot that night. Back in 1994, Roy and Norton had delivered a performance in New Orleans that sealed their reputation forever. During the jazz festival, they played Terraplane Blues, and it brought the crowd to their feet. Norton switched between 5 different harmonicas mid-song to match the complex chord changes. No one else could pull that off so smoothly. The moment was so powerful, it led to invitations from Montreux and North Sea jazz festivals. Europe couldn't get enough of them. In 2003, Roy released Slideways, an instrumental album that reached number 3 on the Billboard Blues chart. It was his highest solo rank. He played with top-tier musicians like Philip Aberg and Zigaboo Modeliste from the Meters. Norton was on it too. That album earned Roy a Blues Music Award nomination. The message was clear. Even in a changing world, instrumental blues could still speak loud. In 2009, Roy dropped another album, Split Decision. He added some modern elements, but kept the soul of Delta blues intact. He even brought in his son Sam. Songs like Patron Saint of Pain showed how much Roy had grown while never losing touch with where he started. That same year, he played the New Orleans Jazz Fest again. this time with Marcia Ball. The crowd loved it. Critics said his slide guitar felt like a time machine. Some said it was better than ever. Roy's Grammy history isn't short either. He's been nominated 8 times. He produced John Lee Hooker's The Healer, which won a Grammy and gave Hooker a career revival. He worked on 3 more Hooker albums after that. He produced Ramblin' Jack Elliott albums too. He co-wrote "Non and On It" with Bonnie Raitt, which also got nominated. And when he worked on the soundtrack for The Hot Spot with Miles Davis, Hooker, and Taj Mahal, that got Grammy attention too. His hands were always in something important. Then, something nearly ended it all. On May 15, 2010, Roy was on stage in Guerneville, California. It was the 3rd song of the night. Suddenly, he felt a burning in his chest, like a hot poker. He tried to keep playing, thinking it was heartburn. Then, the venue lost power. The lights cut. The sound stopped. Roy walked off stage and told his roadie, "Call someone. This isn't right." 90 minutes later, doctors inserted a stent. They said the heart attack could have killed him. But it didn't. 5 days later, he was back on stage in Ukiah, playing for 3,000 people. His cardiologist couldn't believe it. No scar tissue at all. Some said Norton had flicked the power switch from above to save him. That same year, Roy played over 100 shows. One of them got filmed for PBS and reached over 1 million viewers. He started doing heart health awareness events. At 75, he was still on tour with his band, the Delta Rhythm Kings, doing what he'd always done. In 2015, Roy came back after a long pause and released Into the Wild Blue. It was personal. He had lost his brother and his friend Ray Manzarek from the Doors, but instead of slowing down, he poured it all into the music. One track, Song for Robert, was for his brother. Another was a raw cover of Come On in My Kitchen. The critics noticed. They said it sounded like his live shows, alive, emotional, and real. In 2023, Roy released Ghosts of the Past. It included restored recordings with Norton Buffalo, cleaned up using AI. It brought back the duo's magic for a new generation. Now his slide techniques are being taught at Berkeley. Young guitarists log into his online blues clinics. He's still mentoring, still producing, still performing, still moving forward. That's Roy Rogers.